So we're going to explore for the next hour or so the recent controversy over Zoom Sedarim. It's really a couple of different controversies, a couple of different aspects of it in Israel and in America. I'm going to share with you a whole bunch of sources that I have on a file here, so you'll be able to follow along, and we'll go through some of the sources. But really, the goal is both to understand the controversy as it's happened, the different positions, and really to get at what's behind it. What are the different values? What are the different sources? What are the different traditions that the different positions are arguing for? And let me just share the relevant file with you, and we'll be able to jump into this together. So hopefully everyone is seeing the handout or theoretical handout, Halakhic responses to coronavirus, should I have a Zoom Seder? So just 8 days ago is when all the excitement came to the fore. An article in the Jerusalem Post and a few other Israeli publications saying that senior Orthodox rabbis allow Zoom for Passover Seder due to coronavirus. Given the circumstances that we find ourselves in, where shul isn't meeting, people aren't interacting in person all that much, and there's recommendations against joining together for Seder, is a whole topic in itself. But given all of that, how do you include people in your Seder when they're far away geographically? And the position we're going to explore in detail controversially allowed for having Zoom Sedarim, having a joint Seder together with family using the medium of Zoom. So before we read that tshuva, that response in itself, I thought to help organize the material here, source number 2 here, to give some guideposts, to give the basic lay of the land of what we're going to be talking about, and we'll come back to this at the end, and hopefully this will cover some of the main issues here. So first of all, there's more than just one scenario. It's not just one type of case that led to this whole discussion. There really are 2 or maybe 3 distinct scenarios that may be a good reason to have a Zoom Seder in the opinion of some. So one is where you want to unite a family together. Usually you have an intergenerational Seder with parents and their children, and the parents, the grandparents all together. That's a wonderful family event, and this year is a lot harder for that to happen. So maybe there's some that scenario presents a reason to have a Zoom Seder. In a different vein, the questions of isolation, issues of isolation and quarantine can lead to mental health challenges, not being in touch with people over an extended period of time. If you're stuck in your home and you're not using electronic devices, that leads to a problem. So that's a second scenario. And then a third scenario that comes up a little bit is people who don't know how to make their own Seder. They don't know exactly what process to do, and maybe there'd be some way of guiding them using Zoom or even a phone call. So those are the 3 scenarios we're going to see. And this discussion started in Israel, but plays itself out in America as well. And we'll see there are some major differences in terms of what's being discussed and the positions that we find. I'd say probably the 2 main differences are related to one another, which is number 1, that this year, the beginning of Pesach is what we call a 3-day Yontif. Right? The first 2 days of Yom Tov are Thursday and Friday, and that goes right into Shabbos. So that's 72 hours where if you're not using electronics and you're not seeing other people, there's basically no human interaction. So that's one way that the situation in America is different, is more difficult in many ways. And secondly, the second day of Yom Tov, the second Seder, it's on the second day of Yom Tov in America, which doesn't exist in Israel, and there may be some leniencies there, as we'll see. So that's sort of the lay of the land in terms of the scenarios. We'll see over the course of this discussion, there'll be different specific Halakhic issues raised by using Zoom. There'll be different values or reasons that one might want to use Zoom. We'll see all of those as we go forward, and then we'll see where the different positions fall out and what distinguishes them, what really makes a difference in these cases. So let's start in terms of the primary sources with this decision, this tshuva of sorts, published by the Igud Chachmei HaMa'arav Be'eretz Yisrael, the scholars of the West, or the Maghreb in the land of Israel, meaning what some call Sephardic or Moroccan poskim, who all signed.
Rabbi Zuckier, would you be able to zoom in a little bit more?
Of course. Is that helpful, or should I go further?
If you can go further, that would be great.
All right. Okay, so I'm zooming in on Zoom in a shiur about Zoom Seders. Wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
So here we go. So these Moroccan rabbis had the following question. Nish'alnu al yedei Yehudi Talmid Chacham. We were asked by a certain scholarly rabbi if they can use Zoom in order hamechaberet bein zekenim uvnei mishpachotehem, to connect between elderly people and their families. Asher inam yicholim l'shalot b'mchitzatam. They can't be together because of habatzat hanagif, because of the pandemic. And they want to do the Seder together through this program of Zoom or an equivalent. And it goes through some of the details. The question is it masach echad nimtza beveit hazaken, masach echad beveit mishpacha, one screen in the grandparents' house, one screen in the younger family's house. Yachad mitchabrim yachad b'riyah v'dibur b'shema. They're all together in terms of they can see each other, they can hear each other. So this is an important detail. You're not turning on, in this scenario, you're not turning on the Zoom or the computer on Yom Tov. You turn it on before Yom Tov and sort of leave it running. And then that night, you have your Zoom Seder. You don't actually need to do anything on Yom Tov. It's already running. You just, before Yom Tov, you put your computer with Zoom at the head of the table, and then you start your Seder at the appropriate time. In this emergency situation, can we use Zoom in order to connect between a family, a multi-generational family for the Seder? And of course, this is an interesting question for many reasons, one of which no one's ever asked this question before because, well, we didn't really have great Zoom or Skype technology until very recently, and the situation didn't really dictate itself until recently, certainly not on any sort of large scale. The whole point here is because this year no one can stay with their family, there is an interest in connecting virtually using Zoom. So that was the question, and here's the answer. They say there's three potential issues with using Zoom. Aleph, hafalat hamachshir b'yom tov. If you turn it on Yom Tov, that would be a problem potentially. Bet uvdin dechol, doing a non-Yom Tov like things, chol, weekday-like things on Yom Tov, such as using Zoom. And third, once we allow this, there's a worry, what they call the slippery slope, the midron Halakhic, that you'll do this sort of thing in other situations. Maybe next year there won't be a pandemic, but people don't want to stay with their extended family. They want to Zoom, and it's a nice shortcut, and that we don't want that. That's a potential problem. And they go through the various details here. We're not going to read every word of this or any of the sources for reasons of time, but we'll highlight a couple of lines. They say in terms of electricity, they point to a very important backstory. Yadua ki chalukimbo chachmei Yisrael hasfaradim v'chachmei tzefon Africa rubam kichulam matirim uvahem rishon Tzion Rav ben Tzion Uziel. There's the opinion of most Sephardic decisors is to permit the use of electricity on Yom Tov. This is something that's not terribly well known. Generally, if you ask halakhically observant communities, most of them overwhelmingly do not use electricity on Yom Tov, but many Sephardic and North African or Moroccan poskim do allow for the use of electricity on Yom Tov. And they quote a bunch of other names. In our case, though, that's not even necessary. You're not turning on the computer on Yom Tov. It's turned on before. So the biggest worry you have is that maybe there'll be an issue with Zoom, or you'll need to go back in. The screen will time out, whatever it is. So that's the biggest worry. You need to adjust it. But even if you do end up adjusting your computer and using electricity, we can rely on all of these Sephardic rabbis who permit this. And of course, the people who are undersigned are Moroccan rabbis. They're within that tradition. So that's the first issue. Using electricity on Yom Tov, number one, you're not actually using it because it's set up beforehand, at least in theory. And number two, even if you do use it, it's actually permitted according to many. Second, in terms of uvdin dechol, it's like a weekday sort of thing. And they say that it's l'tzorach mitzvah, it's for the purpose of a mitzvah, just like something that's it's rabbinically prohibited for two reasons is permitted for a mitzvah. So too here. And in terms of the worry about the slippery slope, they say it's very clear. Barur lekulam shekol ha'ater hu l'shat cherum bilvad. The permission here is only for an emergency scenario. There's no permission across the board, and it'll be very clear to people that this is only allowed here. And they say that it's very helpful it'll help people fulfill the mitzvah. All the younger generation that might not otherwise have a Seder, because they're connecting with their grandparents over Zoom, they'll fulfill the mitzvah, and it'll also strengthen the grandparents, give them motivation to continue being healthy to fight for their lives. There's the language there. Maybe that's if they're sick, but even if they're not sick, it's just a good healthy thing to have a Zoom Seder with your grandchildren. And they conclude, Al-Kain ner lanu lahatir, therefore we permit this, toch hadgasha shezeh rak lematzav cherem. It's only in an emergency situation. V'rak litzorech leil haseder tafshin pei l'mi shezakuk lezeh. Only for this year's Seder, and only for someone who needs it. And they say it's that we can rely on this, and then they say the blessing. Hopefully, this should lead to v'hasiroti machala mikirbecha. We should have no more disease. And then about 15 or so rabbis sign, including a couple of fairly well-known decisors from the Moroccan community. Now, this is what led to all the articles on last Wednesday, and there was also a lot of pushback among people saying, really, this is not a good heter, not a good permission, and that when they reissued the statement sometime later, a bunch of the names are missing, meaning a bunch of the people who had signed to the original letter pulled out. And you see that the second signed version, there's 7 names here rather than the 15 or 17 or so. But still, Rav Eliyahu Abergel, who's a major posek, is signed, and as are several others. So they didn't retract overall, but some of those who signed the original did retract. I included here a couple of the retractions, Rav Moshe Swissa and Rav Yonatan Sarur, and this is really within hours. It's amazing the speed at which these things happen. If you go back to medieval times, people write a letter, and a few months later they get a letter back, and then they send it to a third party, and within a few years you resolve the dispute and the controversy. And here it's just a few hours between when this is issued and retractions and reissuing the psak. So it's really a very different world that we live in. Technology affects not only the halachic issues themselves, but also the way that they're discussed. So if we just take a quick look at a couple of the highlights of why these poskim, these people who signed the original letter, retracted. So you'll see in Rav Sarur's letter, he says that misunderstood, and he wants to. He says, "We ka'et panenu tzrichim liot le'achdut bekerev harabanim." We need unity among the rabbis. We need rabbinic unity. L'chizuk ma'amada shel harabanut harashit, to strengthen the rabbanut, the national rabbinate. This is not the time to have disputes and breakaway positions. This is the time to have unity, one rabbinic position for everyone. So that's an interesting point. They're not the retraction there is not based particularly on the halachic considerations. He doesn't go into detail about those. Neither one does, but it's about unity. And if we look in the other tshuva, the emphasis is what this might lead to. Right over here, Kedei shelo yehei midron chalaklak, so there won't be a slippery slope. That's again the primary basis of the objection is what this could lead to, not that there's a specific halachic objection in itself. So this is very interesting because very often halachic controversies, the primary thing that's discussed are the halachic sources. Do you accept this position or that position? How do we paskin? Here, right up front, the retractions, the people who change their position, what they're invoking is not halachic sources, but broader policy sources, rabbinic unity or slippery slopes, and that explains their positions. I included here the original psak of Abergel, where he signed on on the sides of that psak. If you want, you can take a look, but we're not going to go into detail about that. Let's take a look at a couple of the objections to the psak by chief rabbis or former chief rabbis. So. We'll focus not just on the position they're taking, but what arguments they're making. So here is David Lau, current Ashkenazic chief rabbi, based on an interview on the radio, but he says the decision is chasar achrayut, it's irresponsible, afilu lo meguchach, it's even worse than a joke. Choser havana minimali shel hamashmaut shel psikat halacha, a lack of basic understanding of what it means to decide halacha. And they're misleading people. This is terrible. And again, what the emphasis is not on the halachic issues per se here. The emphasis is on what this could lead to, how people might get confused, that halachic decision making isn't done like this. again, the considerations, the sort of meta-halachic considerations of slippery slopes and lack of unity, that's what's invoked. If you look in Rav Amar, former chief rabbi, Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, current chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, Sephardic chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, so he takes an even stronger stance, if that's possible. He says, I don't believe that there are rabbis who would permit this. It's impossible. It can't be. And there's all sorts of prohibitions here, minor and major. He doesn't tell you what they are, but he at least gestures at them. Who can estimate all the terrible outcomes that this will lead to? This is a sin that leads to other sins. It's terrible. And he goes on, he says that one of the people who signed on this letter is a Reform rabbi, and it's terrible. So that essentially is the thrust of Rav Amar. Again, in these sources as well, what's invoked is not the pure halachic concerns, but more the meta-halachic or broader or policy concerns. Just to give the other side, Rav Chaim Amsalem, former member of Knesset and also a posek in the Sephardic community, gives permission, supports this position. He again invokes that. Where's the line here? These are all right and present and true. Are great sages from the West of the previous generation, not only North African, Moroccan rabbis, but even other rabbis, and this is true. I'll talk about that in a second. They permitted electricity on Yom Tov, like we're totally fine with it. There's no problem at all. Everyone in Morocco used to use electricity on Yom Tov, and he indicates it's not just Sephardim. And if you look, the Aruch HaShulchan, major Ashkenazi posek of the late 19th or early 20th century, permits using electricity on Shabbos, on Yom Tov rather, as well. And apparently, it is said that the Rav, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, had a family tradition to use electricity on Yom Tov as well, turn on and off lights. So this again is invoking a halachic consideration, the permission of electricity. We'll talk about what the basis of the prohibition of electricity would be in a moment. Just take a look first at, again, the Igud, the organization of Moroccan rabbis, push back on Rav Amar's approach. They talked a little bit about the details, but mostly they were also upset about being called Reform rabbis, without getting into all Israeli discourse that often is a major insult to Orthodox rabbis, which is a whole other discussion in itself. We don't need to get into the details of that right now. But they mainly responded on that and said that, of course, there's a basis for our position, and that largely is the controversy in Israel. So in order to understand what's going on here, what's the dispute about? Some broader policy issues. So it's important to take a step back and talk about what the prohibition of electricity is based on. In, let's say, on Shabbos, when everyone agrees that there's a prohibition against electricity. So as you might be able to guess, the Torah doesn't spell out really many of the malachot, of the prohibited activities on Yom Tov, on Shabbos at all, but it certainly doesn't talk about electricity. Of course, electricity is a modern thing, and when electricity became started being used broadly, there was a whole question as to what exactly its nature is, and whether it should be permitted or prohibited on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, how to understand it. Essentially, there's 4 different positions about electricity. One is that electricity is a form of eish, it's a form of fire, because there's electricity is a spark is like fire. Fire has sparks. Electricity has sparks. There's a fire in the wire, and therefore it's prohibited for use on Shabbos. We'll come back to that view in a second. A second view is that electricity is about building circuits. You turn on and off a light. You're building a circuit, and that's bonet. That's building. That's the prohibition of building. That's the Chazon Ish's position. A third view, which came into vogue in the late 20th century and is probably the mainstream view across the board, is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says that he doesn't think it's biblically prohibited. He doesn't think it's a daraisa. It's a derabanan. Maybe it's a strong minhag related possibly to molid, creating something new. Electricity is clearly creating something new. The lights are off. You turn the lights on, or whatever else you're doing. with the electricity, and that's the reason why electricity is prohibited on Shabbos. And then the fourth view, a very recent view by Rav Usher Weiss, who's posek in Israel today, is that maybe it's makeh patish. It's the prohibition against completing activities. One of the 39 malachos is sort of hard to define, and he thinks that it applies, that the prohibition against electricity is makeh patish. What's going on here, the reason why you would say it's permitted on Yom Tov is if you take the position that it's fire, it's eish. Because fire, despite being biblically prohibited on Shabbos, is actually permitted for use on Yom Tov. Because of the idea of ochel nefesh, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, you're allowed to prepare food, you're allowed to carry too, so you're allowed to use fire. Fire is permitted, and if electricity is simply fire, you're allowed to use fire, and therefore electricity, for personal benefit. And that's the view of these Moroccan rabbis and many Sephardic poskim in earlier times. It's also the view of the Aruch HaShulchan and others. What happened is, at some point, maybe, I think, apparently this happened in the 70s, in Israel, and there was a push to have a united front. And this is what people are referring to, a united rabbinic front is something like this, that if you have, let's say you had all the Sephardim in Israel using electricity on Yom Tov, and all the Ashkenazim not using electricity. It's a very unusual situation, and it doesn't, it probably feels weird to some people. It probably leads people to reject their practice. A mashal for this, a parallel, is kitnios in Israel today. There's a trend, a distinct trend of Ashkenazim giving up the practice of kitnios. Why? Because their Sephardic friends are all using it. It can't be that bad, and then they start using it. So if you want to maintain the Ashkenazi tradition, it's very difficult to do that if the Sephardic tradition is the exact opposite. So there was apparently, and some people are unhappy about this, and this may be part of the story here, there was a lot of pressure put on Sephardic poskim to discourage the use of electricity on Yom Tov. Because let's have a united front, let's have a situation where everyone keeps the same halachot, and that was the push. And now, in a moment of crisis, in an emergency, some of these Moroccan poskim say, you know what, we should probably, at least for this year, we should roll that back. It's so necessary this year to use Zoom, to use electricity on Yom Tov, that we will renege, we'll pull back from that move to prohibit electricity. But it's not usher to use electricity, right? Even the people, right? The people who retracted, the Moroccan poskim who retracted, don't say it's prohibited in itself. They say it's prohibited for policy reasons, because it might lead to the wrong thing. It might mislead people. It wouldn't present a united front. So that's a lot of what's going on among the Israeli poskim. No one, and even people who say there are halakhic issues, no one is saying this is clearly prohibited according to everyone, because they know that if you look at the Moroccan poskim, they say electricity is permitted. There's no prohibition against electricity according to those views on Yom Tov. So that's not the route that the discussion goes down. Instead, the discussion is about broader issues, policy, and slippery slopes. One suggestion made by Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, who's an important for a posek on the younger side, an important decider of halacha in Israel today. He wrote a piece about Zoom for the Seder night. Sounds controversial, but what when you actually look at what he's saying, it's his attempt to have the cake of having your Seder with your grandparents and eating it too. What he suggests is, he starts off by saying, the people who suggest having Zoom at the Seder itself on Yom Tov, he says, prat l'bayot ha'ilchatiyot shehi ma'ala, says it raises some halachic issues. Again, he doesn't go into it. What he goes into is yesh ba baya gdola mibchina ma'asit. There's a major practical problem in having a Zoom Seder. He says because there's going to be some issue with your internet or your Zoom, or the screen will time out. You'll need to fix it, but you can't fix it on Yom Tov. Certainly, if you're Ashkenazi, you can't fix it on Yom Tov. And then you're going to either get upset or you'll fix it anyway. It's just it's a no-win situation. It's not going to work for practical reasons. And therefore, he has an alternative suggestion that's still sort of like having Zoom the Seder night, but slightly different. So he says, every house in Israel, if you're not with your extended family, here's what you should do. Daven mincha early, and an hour or two before Yom Tov starts, dress up in your Yom Tov clothes and have a Zoom with the whole family and sing all the songs from the Seder. You're not gonna do magid. You're not gonna eat matzah and do all the mitzvos of the night, but you'll sing the songs. You'll have the experience of Seder night together with your family over Zoom before Yom Tov. And he preempts the question of, well, isn't that unusual? It's like Baal Tosef, you're adding a day to Pesach. It's not Pesach yet. And his answer is, based on a fascinating teaching of Rabbi Ben Nun, actually, if you look into the idea of Pesach in the Torah, there's really two different holidays that are sort of spliced together. There's the holiday of Chag HaPesach, which really starts on the 14th, the day that you slaughter the Karban Pesach. So according to one of my teachers, he says it starts on noon on the 14th of Erev Pesach, and it ends at midnight that night. It's a 12-hour Chag HaPesach. Then there's Chag HaMatzot. There's the holiday of Matzah, which lasts for 7 days starting that night. So there's the idea, the overall, and these are mixed together. We call them Pesach together, but really it's the 14th, which is Chag HaPesach, and then the next 7 days, which are Chag HaMatzot. So your celebration, the afternoon of the 14th before Pesach starts, is actually part of Pesach itself. It's Chag HaPesach, so you start a bit early, and that's fine. And he says you should sing Seder songs and Chad Gadya and all of that. And he says, Umnam lo yeh Seder zeh malei im kol hasabim v'asavtot, aval yeh mifgash miragesh sheyesh bo atchala mashmutit l'leil Seder. It's a good start. It's a good pregame, so to speak, for your Seder. You'll do the mitzvahs, you'll eat the matzah later, but for now you have the experience. So I think in terms of the Israeli challenge, what was framed primarily in the Moroccan Tshuva, which is elderly grandparents who can't be with their extended family, and that separation and wanting to have the experience together, Rav Rimon's solution seems to really solve that completely. Okay, it's not exactly at the night of the Seder, it's a few hours earlier, but okay, you still have your experience, and then a day later you can call the grandparents as soon as Yom Tov is over and talk about the Seder. It seems to really solve that problem. We'll see in a minute, of course, in America, the problem that's focused on is a different one, and we'll see it'll need to be solved in different ways. Before we get to that, one fascinating position of Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, who's a major posek in the Haredi world, and he's the son-in-law of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, one of the main Gedolim, if not the main Gadol in the Haredi community in Israel today. He says he was asked by his father-in-law to respond, and to this idea of a Zoom Seder, on the actual Seder night. And he quotes Rav Moshe Feinstein, Igros Moshe, Shedam b'dvar sha'ona ne'erach me'erev Shabbos, she'yadlik tanur chashmali v'yaschil v'ashel b'Shabbos kesha'a lifnei ha'achila. What about timers? Using a timer to heat up the food Shabbos morning. You have a blech, use a timer for your blech. Rav Moshe Feinstein says it's prohibited to use a timer for your blech, or a timer for your air conditioning, or a timer for your lights on Shabbos, because this is a great denigration of Shabbos. How is it Shabbos if you have things automatically turning on? Okay, you said it before Shabbos. It's still having electricity be used, having that happen in your house is against the experience of Shabbos. And he goes on and says this is the same thing. Having Zoom, even if you started before Yom Tov, having Zoom run on Yom Tov is a zilzol, is a denigration of Yom Tov, and it leads to more prohibitions. It's a terrible thing, and it shouldn't be allowed. Now, what's so fascinating about this tshuva, and many of you are probably thinking this, well, if I had, let's do a vote. I can't even see I'll switch to, no, can I do that? Let's see, stop share for a second. Let's see, let's have a vote for those of you who are here. Who generally refrains from using timers on Shabbos because it's prohibited, right? And who, or they, or people in their household use timers on Shabbos right. So basically across the board, just about, I can't say everyone, but probably the overwhelming majority of observant Jews in America today use timers on Shabbos for their devices. And Rav Moshe Feinstein's psak, although it was accepted by some early on, is today basically not accepted at all in America. I assume Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein's community still accepts it, and they don't use it. They probably don't use electricity at all because it's on the grid, and that's a whole other discussion. But what's going on here, the story that happened with Rav Moshe Feinstein's tshuva was, at the time, electricity was something new. Having electricity in your house was this totally anti-Shabbos thing, and you couldn't have even a timer. And within a couple of decades, people were used to things running on timers, whether that's your air conditioning sort of turning on a cycle or other things. And it just became a lot more normal. It didn't feel anti-Shabbos. It didn't feel like Zilzal Shabbos to have things run on a timer. And once that was the case, once it was no longer against the spirit of Shabbos, people, the poskim shifted, and they said, now there's no more problems. Zilzal Shabbos, feel free to use timers on Shabbos. The question, if I could ask Rav Zilberstein a question, I would say, well, aren't you concerned, or what do you think about a scenario where 10, 20 years from now, there are so many more things that are automated, video screens that are automated, like a lot of shuls now have a video, a video that's automated. It says, mincha is at this time. I remember the first time I saw that, and I'm not that old, whatever it was, 15 years ago, I saw that in a shul, and I'm like, what's going on here? Why is there electricity on Shabbos? Then I thought about it and said, wait a second, it's turned on before, it's automatic, there's nothing prohibited about it, so maybe it doesn't feel so anti-Shabbos, right? And that, I think we all went through, those of us who go to shuls that had that, that was a shift, and now it doesn't feel so weird anymore. So I would ask Rav Zilberstein, what happens 20 years from now when automatic videos are just happening all the time, and somehow our feeling is different? Would you then say that it's permitted to have a Zoom Seder? I would guess he would say no, although I don't know for sure. I asked someone who was promoting his response, and he said, we'll worry about this year now, we'll worry about 20 years from now later, which is a certain way of approaching halacha. Do you sort of deal with the issues in a local way, and you worry about the consequences later? You need to think about that a little bit, but your primary responsibility is for now. So a fascinating response here by Rav Zilberstein. He invokes a halachic consideration of Zilzal Shabbos, but it's one that is flexible. Because the biggest proof that it's flexible is the very source he quotes, that Rav Moshe Feinstein, which has shifted from being followed broadly when it was issued originally to basically not being followed at all in America today. Now we shift from Israel to America, and the challenge in Israel, in America, the primary question in America is a very different one than Israel. In Israel, it was primarily about having multi-generational families get together. Maybe that reflects the fact that Israel, the culture in Israel is a very family-oriented culture, a very unified sort of culture. In America, the main question that's been raised, and we see that in the Chuvos, we see that in discourse even on Facebook and just across the board. The main question is less about families, although that comes up a little bit too. The main question is about people with mental health challenges. And there's a variety of situations that there's a variety of scenarios where one's health is put at risk by being alone. Especially in America, remember that it's a 3-day Yom Tov. So if let's say you live alone and you're not going out because of coronavirus, and it's a 3-day Yom Tov, so you're not in touch with anyone over the computer either. So you essentially would have no human contact for 3 days. That, for many people, for some people, it's just sort of sad or slow or a downer. For some people, that can lead to real mental health challenges. So that's the question that's being addressed here primarily, or in America, I would say primarily. This tshuva by Rav Hershel Schachter of YU deals with both issues. We'll start with the second half, where he talks about the first half talks about people who have mental health issues. We'll get back to that in a second. First, let's see how he treats the Israeli issue at the bottom of the page here that I'm highlighting. So he says, he says, people, if you're not sick, mishu eino choleh baruch Hashem, if thank God you're not sick, you're alone for Yom Tov. It's painful, if there's no risk to your health, we can't permit the violation of Shabbos or Yom Tov. And he talks about a situation where this is the third scenario I mentioned. What about you have a Baal Tshuva, someone who doesn't have a history of making seders, wants help making the seder. He says, Misha mash'ir telephone shelo patuach me'erev Yom Tov. You leave your phone on, or you start a phone call and leave it open. Ve'oreich the seder beveito b'kol be'ofen she'acherim yuchlu lishmoa v'laroch seder kimoto. You just leave it there on speakerphone, and you do your seder, and you say, the people on the other line will just follow what you're doing. So he says, "Ulai yesh makom le'akel b'shat al-chat gadol." This is a little surprising. He says, in a situation of real need, and he goes on to specify the person on the other end, for some reason has no access to videos to learn how to do a seder. They can't figure it out. The only way they can do a seder is if you help them through a phone call. So he says, "Ki k'mo shekatav Goram Moshe Feinstein, bigger Moshe." זה לא כל כך ברור איזה איסור יש לדבר בטלפון שהיא כבר פתוחה. As Rav Moshe Feinstein said, now this is a major leniency by Rav Moshe Feinstein, it's not clear what the prohibition is to talk into a phone that's already been, you already picked it up before. You made the call before Yom Tov, and now you want to talk into the phone on Yom Tov. It's not clear what the prohibition is. You're not opening a new circuit. The only difference is the frequency of the wavelengths of the sound changes. It's not clear what the prohibition is. So therefore, he obviously wouldn't say to do that in a normal situation, but in a situation where there's some great need, like helping this person make their Seder if they have no other way to do that, then it might be permitted. Again, he says you should try not to do that, but he says there's a difference between phones and Zoom. Leaving your internet on, which I assume means Zoom, so others see you. We have a new issue that's introduced here by Rav Shechter, and I believe he's basing himself on an opinion of the Rabbi Soloveitchik. A new category here. It's not a question of electricity. That he said it's not a clear issue, or at least if it's on beforehand, it's not a clear issue. Not a question of uvdin d'chol, of it being like a weekday. Not an issue of slippery slope or practical issues. This is an issue of roshem, that or kotev, that if you have a Zoom call like we're doing right now, so my face is here, yet you're seeing it there on your screens. The fact that I'm projecting my, whatever's in the background here to you, that's considered writing. So any movements I make with the intent that you'll see what I'm doing, you see that I'm, picking up this paper, I'm essentially writing on your computer screen. Now, if I was just looking at my own computer screen, he spells this out, we're not going to read it. If I was just looking at my own computer screen, that's not too meaningful. That's like looking at your reflection in the mirror. But if I'm doing something to make an impact on your screen far away, that counts as actually counts as writing. And he says it's not, since you're not saving the image, it's not automatically saved, although maybe if you're recording it, it is. But in the normal case, you're not saving the image, so it's not biblically prohibited. It's still rabbinically prohibited. I'll call So therefore, when you do your call to help the person make the Seder, you should do it not on Zoom, but over phone, by the phone. Maybe he would also allow doing it over Zoom with just the sound function, without, with the screen turned off. That's what it sounds like from here. So therefore he opposes using a video, but it's okay with using a phone in certain scenarios if it's really a great need. So that's very interesting. He doesn't actually spell out what he would say about a case where you have someone where they're not quite, there's no major mental health risk, but they're sort of, it's uncomfortable. They're maybe have a very bad experience on Yom Tov. If you don't call them on the phone, he doesn't say what he would say in that scenario. One could construct an argument that it would be permitted based on this here, but he doesn't go there. So maybe he would disagree with that extension. Was there a hand? Did I see someone raise their hand? Or are there a couple questions? We can have a short break for questions now, and then we'll shift from the Israeli question to the American question, and focus on mental health and then some broader considerations.
Yeah, the raised hand was me. Even by that, taking that at its face, there's a lot to unpack from the past couple of minutes. But in that tshuva itself, wouldn't it be kosev to call someone, because then there are changes on the screens of the phones nowadays. I mean, most of us have smartphones that are going to show up. Oh, it's this caller, it's this person. Some of them show the octave levels and stuff like that. Like there's all sorts of things that happen on a phone when you call someone. So
right. So yeah. So I'd say, it's not fully clear. You don't have the full details here. As far as I can understand, there's a couple of things. So it needs to be something that you intend. If it's something that happens sort of accidentally, how loud it is and you have the decibels, that, if you don't really care about that, presumably that would fall by the wayside. The same, again, I'm not sure about this. This is my extrapolation. The same way that like having it be slightly louder on a phone call affects the electricity in some ways, and you just don't care, and you don't understand the electricity going up or down, or the wattage changing. But yeah, maybe something like maybe calling on a smartphone would be a problem. I don't know if you're calling with the goal of having him see your name come up, maybe that is, although maybe you could argue it's not direct enough, because you're not dictating exactly what it would do. You're sending a message, and the phone itself is choosing to respond depending on its setting. So I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I saw a couple other hands were raised. I think in the interest of getting to the rest of the shiur, why don't we move forward now and have the questions at the end? I know it's always tough. There's so much to think about. Yeah, I have like a lot of questions myself as I'm talking because it's such a fascinating, rich, and new discussion. But let's hold it off for the end. The first half of Rav Shechter's tshuva. Oh, and one sort of interesting note. When he quotes the Rav Moshe that he says it's not clear why it's prohibited to talk into a phone, that appears in the Hebrew text, but not in the English translation. That's below. So it doesn't appear in the English translation, presumably because the thought that could be used to the wrong ends. People might misapply that. So it's, if you can understand Rabbinic Hebrew and that discussion, then you can consider that. If not, you're probably better off not knowing. That presumably is the intention of the people who wrote and translated these letters. In terms of the American issue is primarily about mental health and other danger. There's really three different dangers if one does not allow a Zoom call. Three different types. Number one is physical health in the form of potential self-harm for people who are in a situation where extended period of time alone could lead to self-harm. A second scenario is people who will choose not to stay alone and instead will, because of their concern that they'll have a difficult time in terms of their mental health, they'll instead go to family on Yom Tov, and while generally that's a good thing, in this case, there's a certain risk attached to it, given that everyone is trying to self-isolate with their household to minimize the spread of coronavirus. And there's a third risk, which would be to one's mental health itself, meaning even leaving aside issues of self-harm and pikuach nefesh in the usual sense, there's a chance that one's mental health could really deteriorate and put them in a much worse situation. Rav Shechter here in the first half of the tshuva, we're not going to read it inside, is fairly lenient in terms of this. He says, usually there's a question of how to define pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh, saving a life, overrides all of the prohibitions in the Torah with the exception of the big three, murder, sexual prohibitions, and idolatry. It overrides Shabbos. And Rav Shechter is fairly lenient in a variety of different directions. He says, and some of this is based on explicit sources, Shulchan Aruch, some of this is less obvious. The Shulchan Aruch says if you have a doubt as to whether there's a risk to someone's life, then you violate Shabbos, right? Safek b'kuach nefesh is l'chumra. Even a sfeik seika, even if you're not sure if there's something and you're not sure for a couple of different reasons, it's really, it's not like a major risk. It's a small risk to someone's life. You violate Shabbos for that. So that's point number one. Point number two is that if there's a chance that you will, quote unquote, go crazy or go enter shigaon, lose your mental health in a significant way. He quotes Rabbi Soloveitchik, you have no worry that you will end up dying as a result of the shigaon. Still, the very prevention of having a major mental health crisis, of having you, quote unquote, lose your mind, you're permitted to violate Shabbos for that. So in these different ways, and then he also talks about if you have a sick relative in Israel, let's say, and you want to call them to check in on them, and you think that'll strengthen them and help their physical health, that's on the second day of Yom Tov, let's say, to call Israel, he says that's also permitted. So in a few different ways, he's fairly lenient on this question of pikuach nefesh, which is significant for a couple of reasons. I don't think the psak that Rav Shechter gave now is any different than what he would have given 1 year ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. What's different, though, is the fact that it's being said and the way in which it's being said. Even as recently as March 22nd, Rav Shechter essentially said the exact same thing that he published a few days later. But if you look, he said as well, this should not be publicized to the rabbin. This shouldn't be publicized to the general public, this permission. And then a week later, he publicized it. So there was a shift, not in terms of the psak itself, but in terms of how to publicize this decision, because as this is becoming a more dangerous situation for more people, it's a more challenging time. The usual worry about the slippery slope and the psak being used incorrectly is overridden by a worry that not enough people will use the psak. That people will say, well, I don't need to call a friend on Yom Tov and end up actually harming themselves or entering a situation of danger. So it seems like there has been a shift in terms of how much to talk about these issues publicly versus to have it be talk to your rabbi. This will be a private psak, what they call a retail rather than wholesale psak that stays more private. Furthermore, Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig was working on a book on mental health and halacha. He's a rabbi in Israel. The other day or yesterday, I think it was, had a Facebook post where he goes into great detail about different scenarios. If you look in the letters here, A through F, we're not going to read through it straight, but it goes into very specific scenarios of how, if you have a history of psychosis, if you have a history of A or, X, Y, or Z, and if the risk factor is this, if it's that, what the standard is, and what point one should just call someone. And he also says at the end, I think this is very powerful, if you don't know anyone who will take your call, I'll gladly give you my number. I'll answer you day and night, right? So I think we're seeing not just from Rav Schechter and Rav Yoni Rosenzweig, but from many poskim, many halakhic authorities, real sensitivity and openness to supporting people with mental health challenges as it's so difficult right now. So just to summarize Rav Schechter's view, on the one hand, he introduces a new factor in which he's stringent, which is roshem, using Zoom in a case where there's no risk to life, that creating the images is prohibited, which wasn't even addressed by the Israeli decisors. He's also very lenient on the pikuach nefesh, on any scenario that might involve a risk to someone's well-being, someone's life, or even mental health. No one really disagrees on that point. So that's not, in terms of Rav Schechter's psak and Yoni Rosenzweig's psak, there may be some differences on very minute details, but the overall, there's no real controversy there. I think the main issue, as I said, was whether to publicize it and how to publicize it. But one thing we do find, if we look at other people who have published on this issue very recently, I'll say one from the more left-wing side of modern orthodoxy and one from the Halakhic Egal community, we find a couple of other interesting phenomena and shifts, and not necessarily in a practical sense, but in the way of conceptualizing the idea of doing Zoom on Yom Tov. So one, Rabbi Yisachar Katz, who essentially follows Rav Schechter, in terms of what's permitted and when, pikuach nefesh, there's risk to life, it's permitted, but he adds some very interesting, he goes into a certain amount of detail, not about in what cases it's permitted, like Yoni Rosenzweig. I mean, I'm sure he could do that too, but he goes into detail as to how to do it. If you wanted to do to call someone over Zoom on Yom Tov for the sake of your mental health, how would you do it? And what's interesting is how, at least in theory, how his theoretical understanding of what Zoom constitutes, how stringent he is. He says activating a new Zoom session may be a biblical prohibition. Now, no one we've seen until now, we saw a lot of people who said, do Zoom, don't do Zoom. No one said Zoom is biblically prohibited in a normal situation where no one's life is at risk. Rabbi Katz jumps in and says, activating a Zoom session may be biblically prohibited. That's why, that's why it has all sorts of implications in terms of how to use it. If you're going to use it, preferably, if you have a chance, try to use it with a shinu. You do it indirectly. Try to make sure it's turned on beforehand so you minimize the malacha. Try to keep the computer active straight on. So he goes into all these details of ways of minimizing the the malacha, that one's doing, and he says that because he comes out and says that he thinks doing a Zoom session is actually biblically prohibited. Now, as I said, this is really striking. All the people who in Israel who said don't do Zoom, they could have said using Zoom is biblically prohibited. Don't do it, right? They could have said Zoom is roshem, like Rav Schechter said. They were stringent in practice, but not for halakhic reasons, for meta-halakhic reasons. Here in America, Rav Schechter in terms of roshem, and now Rabbi Katz in terms of Zoom overall, says it's biblically, says they invoke halakhic consideration, saying Zoom is biblically prohibited. So, and then I think this sort of explains where Rabbi Katz is coming from. He says, using Zoom to broadcast the Seder, if one doesn't have any mental health issues, it's not just a biblical prohibition or rabbinic one, it's worse, because it undermines the core essence of Shabbat and Chag. Shabbos and holidays, Yom Tov, are times when there's no electricity, no Zoom. Having Zoom communicating remotely over Shabbos and Yom Tov is the sort of thing that undermines the nature of the day. And I think what's behind this idea, and I think if you follow Rabbi Katz is thinking on these things, he said so explicitly, is that he's really what you would call a realist about technology. Right now we're all talking over a Zoom chat. you can conceptualize this both generally and halakhically one of two ways. You can say, we're not talking right now. I'm in a room by myself. There's like particles in the computer screen projecting onto the background here, and there's some communication with other particles that project into a background on each of your screens. We're not actually talking. This is all this. It's all fake. We're not actually talking to each other. It feels like we're talking to each other, but it doesn't really matter. That's what you might call, like a sort of a technical way of understanding it. A realist way of understanding what's going on is no. The real experience that we're having is one of communicating. I guess I'm talking too much and I'm not giving you a chance to talk. We'll change that in a minute or two. So a realist view is that we are communicating. And I think part of the difference here between Rai Katz and the other views, Rai Katz is very committed to a realist view of technology, that using Zoom to speak over, it's just electricity. Electricity is probably derabanan. If it's the rice, it's H, it's probably permitted. That's not the way he's thinking about it. He's not making it into a technical thing. It's a form of writing. I'm writing on your screen. And sort of similar to Rav Schechter's view of Roshem, but taken a step further to be Doraisa, to be a biblical prohibition. Similarly, a recent publication coming out of Hadar, source number 12 here, they end up in somewhat similar view to other positions, but they point to a few things that are very surprising. They talk about electricity itself and the various questions about electricity. We talked about that a little bit, and when it's permitted to use electricity, when it's not. But then they talk about other potentially forbidden activities involved in using Zoom, and one of them is writing, Roshem, and they give a few other examples, similar to what Rav Schechter said. But they talk about tchum. This is a very novel application. I don't know if anyone's ever suggested this before. That tchum, you're not supposed to travel outside of your area on Shabbos. Since nowadays we live in cities mostly, your area is basically your city, so this doesn't really come up too much. But what about Zoom? You're talking right now, we're talking across great distances. There are people on the West Coast. Isn't that going out of the tchum? If you have a Zoom session with your family in Israel or wherever else, or even New York to Boston, isn't that going outside of the tchum? And they say, this is more metaphorical. It's not literally outside. This is admittedly more of a metaphoric concern. You're not actually walking to them, but part of Shabbat Yom Tov is about remaining local. I think part of what might be in the backdrop is the conservative tshuva about driving on Shabbos, but we won't get into that now. They also talk about Hashmas Kol, making noise. You're not supposed to make loud noises on Shabbos. In general, people are very lenient. Some people say, well, you shouldn't leave your washing machine running because it makes noise. So, but something like a conversation, like what I'm doing right now, I don't know of any posek who would say this is Hashmas Kol. But again, here they're jumping in and saying it's Hashmas Kol. Why are there these views here? I think again, it's a realist view. It's saying that we're talking, it's not just about me and a screen and electricity. There are other issues too. If you think about technology, not as just, some technical thing, is electricity or not, it's about an interaction. We're interacting across distances. Is that a problem with tchum? I'm making noise in your house right now. Is that an issue of Hashmas Kol? And I think it's just a different way of thinking about technology. They actually have a leniency as well. They seem to open up the possibility of doing a Zoom Seder for the second night of Yom Tov, when in general, no one else we've seen has suggested this in practice, but in theory, the second day of Yom Tov is a lower level of severity. It's only a derabanan or maybe minhag of Osenu B'Yadeinu, long discussion about what that means, the Gemara in Beitza, but it's a lower level prohibition than the first day of Yom Tov. But there's a long-standing practice of not distinguishing between the way we treat the first and second day of Yom Tov. And yet, here, this article came out of the Hadar Halakhic egalitarian world is suggesting that maybe if they don't like it, but they're sort of okay with it, if being alone for a long time won't lead to any sort of risk, but will be very difficult, will be very hard, maybe there's room to allow for a Zoom Seder on the second day of Yom Tov, because it's only Zoom, not the most severe prohibition, and it's only the second day of Yom Tov. You put those together, you allow it. I have heard reports that an Orthodox shul rabbi suggested allowing a similar thing, although he hasn't gone on record, and I'm not going to out him. But my sense is this isn't just coming out of the Hadar world. There are some people in the Orthodox world who are willing to go down this route. What does all this mean? So where does this leave us? There was a lot of material here, a lot of information. So I think we can sort of summarize the issues here as follows. The halachic issues relating to Zoom. So we saw several of these came up in the original psak. The question of electricity is a major issue here. What your tradition is about electricity, if you're Moroccan or not, makes a big difference. What do you think about uvdin dechol, not in the spirit of Yom Tov? Some people are more stringent about that, some are less. What about slippery slopes? The worry that this will lead to violating Yom Tov other times, or maybe even violating Shabbos. What about practical issues? Will it be uncomfortable for people? Will it not work out to have the Zoom run? And Roshem, the idea of writing, which we saw Rav Schechter introduced as an additional provision. There's all these halakhic issues, and I guess there were more that the Hadar article introduced, although I think those are far enough outside the mainstream that they're not, I wouldn't put them on a summary. So those are the halakhic issues. But as we said, the halakhic issues, and some of those are meta-halakhic, they're going up against some of the values. There are values on the other side, the value of human life, both mental health and physical health in various ways, that, if you have a real pikuach nefesh situation, then everything is permitted. Using any sort of electronics is permitted to save a life. What about family unity? That was primarily in the Sephardic psak. They're concerned about having the family be together to support the grandparents, to support the religiosity of the children. So those are the two main factors. But then there's this other value, the integrity of the Yom Tov experience, right? Well, thinking about both this year, what makes Yom Tov meaningful and important this year, but also thinking about next year and every future year. What's Yom Tov and Shabbos going to look like in the future? That's another important value that comes up explicitly and implicitly in a lot of sources. And then finally, the value of presenting a united front among halachists. And I think, so these are the issues that come up in the various cases. I think the most fascinating thing here is, we're very used to saying, well, there's a dispute here. It's the right wing against the left wing. The Haredim are Machmir, the modern Orthodox are Mekil Or, the Zionists say Hallel, the non-Zionists don't say. We're used to all these categories, the sort of classic set of categories and disputes that exist. Here, I think the dividing lines totally break down. All the usual questions, the usual dividing lines don't hold up. First of all, so what are the factors? Obviously, one factor is going to be your halakhic pedigree. Are you Moroccan with the tradition that electricity is mutter and Yom Tov? Although not only Moroccans, right? Because the Rav and the Aruch HaShulchan, but fine. That's one question. Also, what do you think about Roshem? Do you think that having a Zoom call is Roshem? There are various issues halakhically that come up. But then we have this question about, are you a realist or are you a formalist about electricity, right? Or do you say that it's about the experience of us talking? That's really something that's a deoraisa, or do you say no? It's not. We're not worried about that. So we pointed before to how the machmir position here, the more stringent position, seeing this as a realist issue with more prohibition, saying it's deoraisa, is actually what people are usually on the left. I don't love these categories, but here to undermine them, I'm happy to invoke them. Right. So Rabbi Yisachar Katz is the one who says that it's deoraisa to use Zoom. Why? Because he thinks this is an actual real mode of communication. We're actually talking, and we're talking in a prohibited way on Yom Tov, unless there is someone's life at risk. What's funny is and we didn't look at this inside. The Hadar Tshuva also says, what about being yotzei different mitzvos of the Seder? Let's say you make your bracha at the end of Magid, and I hear you and say Amen. Can I be yotzei? Can I fulfill my mitzvah of saying that bracha of Magid? And they're sort of open to it. And that's a similar question. That's where it's a leniency. If you're a realist about technology, we're actually talking. So what you say, your bracha, when I say Amen, we're actually talking to each other. That counts. Who very recently said a very similar thing, ironically, interestingly, Rav Schechter. Rav Schechter, about reading the Megillah. For those who are in quarantine, said, you can listen to the Megillah on Purim over Zoom or phone or whatever, and if you have no other choice, that is, you can be yotzei. It sounds like he says you can be yotzei b'diavad. You can fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah. So that's the same idea based on this realist view of technology. Whereas, let's say all the Israeli poskim that I've seen do not take a realist view. They all say it's a technical issue. It's prohibited, but it's prohibited for technical reasons. So that's one case where you have, you don't usually say that, Rav Schechter is on the same side as Rabbi Yisachar Katz against all Israeli poskim. That's not a usual, alignment. That's a very interesting one, and has to do with how you view electricity. And then secondly, a question of localist, what I call localist versus globalist. When we think about this issue, how much are we thinking about what's right in front of us right now, and how much are we thinking about broader concerns? So here, this breaks down in a whole bunch of different directions. How much are we worried about next year or 20 years from now? So in that way, those who are machmir, those who are stringent, say, well, we're really worried about a slippery slope next year. The Sephardic, the Moroccan poskim say, we're worried about right now. We're not so worried about leading to future things. Just say it's only for now and you're fine. the person who oddly enough agrees with them, apparently, or I think, at least can be seen as agreeing, is the view that invokes Rav Moshe Feinstein as the reason not to do a Seder. You can't, to say that it's Uvdin Dechol, it's Zilzol Yom Tov, it's a degradation of Yom Tov. To use Zoom, you're at least risking the possibility that, just like Rav Moshe Feinstein's view about timers, 20 years from now, people won't find Zoom to be a Zilzol. So that's a localist view. I'm worried about right now. 20 years from now, we'll worry about that later. Whereas most other poskim, I think, the people who opposed the Sephardic Psak, a lot of them, the Moroccan Psak, a lot of them was based on a worry about future years. And it was also based on another globalist worry. Are you worried not just about these, the people who follow these Moroccan poskim, but how much are you worried about other Jews who will, look at their neighbor who's Moroccan, who uses Zoom? Why shouldn't I use Zoom? How much are we worried about that? And how much are we looking for unity, rabbinic unity, which was invoked by at least one of the positions of those who pulled out? So I think the dividing lines between these positions are a whole new set of categories, not the usual ones. And being machmir and being makil can stem from the same thing. If you're a realist, that can be a chumrah or a kula. If you hold that electricity on Yom Tov is fire, that could be a chumrah on Shabbos or a kula on Yom Tov. It's really a fascinating and mind-bending issue. Partially, that's just the case, but also because of the situation we find ourselves in, where everything's turned on its head. Human interaction, we've said for so long, is about getting off our devices, and now human interaction is all about getting on our devices. And what is Shabbos and Yom Tov supposed to look like? Is it by definition being away from our electronic devices, or maybe we can use our electronic devices to come together? So I'm not going to present the psak. I think if you read here, you can see what's sort of mainstream and what's sort of the minority position, and that should come out of the sources themselves, I hope. And I'm happy to take questions here. I'm much more interested right now in thinking about the broader implications and the conceptual issues. So with that, I'm done. Happy to take questions. And I'm sorry it's going a bit later than originally planned, but I think there's so much to talk about here that, I'm excited to have the discussion.
Rabbi Zuckier, there were a bunch of questions in the chat box. Do you want to take a look at those?
Sure, let's do that. Let me exit the share. And oh wow, there's a chat box. See, this is the danger of sharing the screen, is that I'm focused on the text. And okay. Let's see. I'll take a look. Why don't people start asking, and I'll skim this while people are asking. And Yehudis, can you call on people just because I don't? Yeah, that's probably easier that way.
Sure. If you want to just raise your hand, I'll unmute you if you're having trouble. Martin, are you trying to? Anybody? No? Okay. Why can't I get this? Okay, I'm unmuting everyone here. Hopefully we won't have too much feedback.
One question I'll just answer quickly. Why, if it's not being recorded, why is it writing? Because it's temporarily writing. You're writing on the screen. Every time I move, I'm causing something to be written on your screen momentarily. Even if it's not recorded, it's still prohibited. It's still prohibited rabbinically, according to Rav Schechter. Speakerphone amplification presumably would not be an issue. Right, there are of course technical issues. Google Meet stays on forever. Zoom is 40 minutes, except in the more fancy editions, that's only 24 hours. There obviously are all sorts of technical differences you can make here. People who are very ill, it depends on the exact question. Of course, there are broader issues about internet and the challenges that presents in terms of giving too much control to the Zuckerbergs of the world. No relation.
President Rabbi calling to ask for money for Yontif?
Oh. Sorry.
Yes.
I don't know.
Okay, I think I've gone through most of the questions.
What?
If you're not going to be speaking, please mute your buttons. If you want to speak, just raise your hand or press something on the I will unmute you.
Okay, so I think I've gone through most of the questions in the chat. If you have another question still in the chat, feel free to ask it, and we'll go through people now.
Okay.
Sorry, I see a couple of people like on the camera trying to raise their hand. There's actually like a button on Zoom that you can use to raise your hand. So yeah.
I invited about 20.
Okay. Thank you. There's somebody in the background that I'm hearing their, I think a phone conversation. So I'm not sure who that is. If you want, let's start. Judy Tuckman, I apologize, I don't know.
I'm
what
Mike.
Mike, okay, had the question.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that, as I recall, it's many years ago, but as I recall, Rabbi Moshe said that I can't do anything about the lights being on Shabbos because it's so popularized, it's so, obviously he's not talking about an Issa V'Heter issue. He's talking about that the Shabbos will become no Shabbos if the dishwasher goes on and the oven goes on and everything is going on. But he points out that I can't stop the Shabbos clock putting on the lights because it's so prevalent now that there's nothing I can do about it. So I think it's important to make a distinction between the policy issue that he's talking about and the Issa V'Heter issue that he's talking about.
According to Moshe, it doesn't sound like there's an Issa V'Heter issue. What he says, the prohibition he invokes is, or I mean, depends how you define your terms. He invokes Zilzal Shabbos. The whole issue is
Absolutely
Zilzal
right.
Shabbos.
Right, that's my point.
Right, exactly. And then when Rav Zilberstein quotes Rav Moshe,
he looks at it as
runs the risk of going the same direction as the original Rav Moshe. So I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Josh, did you had a question?
Yeah, more. First of all, Yasher Koach Chazaka Barucha to Reb Zuckier. I really appreciate this. So really, sorry, but it's more of I kind of wanted to draw attention to something. I think that while in your signpost summary, I think you nailed a lot of things, but I think you take. You were taking the statements of some of the Rebbeim criticizing the initial tshuva from the Moroccan rabbis at face value, and I think there's a lot of subtext there of a lot of Israeli politics, and I'm not going to get into it, and I don't want to that's not the focus of this discussion, but I think that there's something to be said of there's some politics at play there related to Mizrahi and Ashkenazi dynamics, especially within the Haredi world. For example, the way in which Rabbi Lau, he didn't say, oh, this is not halakhically justified. He specifically calls out and says the rabbis are unlearned, which is a very common refrain against the Mizrahi, a lot of Mizrahi rabbis, especially from Morocco, who tended to take these more lenient views as, oh, they're unlearned. It's like, well, they're not necessarily unlearned, but you just disagree with them. But there's politics there, and
for sure, and 100%
going on there.
And I think the politics informs the Halakhic consensus, meaning the very question of the very assertion of we want rabbinic unity here is invoking the shift that happened 40, 50 years ago where Moroccan and other Sephardi poskim were asked to not allow electricity on Yom Tov in order to have unity, in order that Ashkenazim would keep their practices disallowing electricity, to stop the temptation, so to speak. So yeah, every time you talk about unity, and I think I posted about this last week on Facebook, and some of my Sephardic friends of a certain bent really took exception to that formulation of unity, because they see it as being forced by the Ashkenazim to do what they want. And of course, this ties into, as you're saying, in Israeli society, a long history of Ashkenazim controlling all the decisions, etc. So yeah, I don't want to go into that too much, but it seems to be a factor in the sense that it's what stands behind the idea of rabbinic unity. You can have rabbinic unity in either direction, right? So going.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that should be the focus, but I just wanted to point it out and say it's a broader it's a broader topic in this discussion that I think just needs to be touched on.
Thanks so much, Josh. Shani, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. So I just responded to what we were just saying there, that idea of unity. It's not only the hegemony of the Ashkenazim, which is, I do think it's important. They're very much a part of the Shiur. Why not? It's a policy that's affecting what's going on, but also just a postmodern, right? It's a very modern view of what we want for identity as compared to today, thinking about pluralism and diversity. So that also plays in. These are all things that I think affect the halakha. In terms of what I wrote about how the whole internet is monetized, it wasn't just my ethics. I know you know how I feel about that, but it really is a Yom Tov question. right? When we're doing this now, you're talking about what are we doing? Are we doing electricity? Are we making sounds? What we're doing is earning advertising money for Zoom. As far as Zoom is concerned, and when they talk to their investors, my bottom line is not just my bottom line, my raison d'etre is to get money. So we might like to not think about that, but that's what we're facilitating. So it's true, we don't have intention for that. Some of us have really intention not to do that, if possible, but it's going on. And it's a zilzul for me. Like, you know, when I've even considered when I was lonely for other reasons, I was living in Germany and Shabbat was difficult for me. And like one of the things is it's not Shabbistic or whatever, because it really isn't. This is like the essence of my whole life.
I'll just add, I think it's an important consideration. I'd say the Halakhic parallel in traditional literature is the question of reading the newspaper with advertisements, which, you know, there's a long literature opposing that. And it doesn't seem like it's followed too much today. I mean, all you need to do is open up Mishpacha or Ami magazine, and it's half advertisements. And, you know, they censor other things, but they don't censor the advertisements, even though everyone knows that everyone reads it on Shabbos and reads all the advertisements. So I think there's the move has been, you call it late capitalism or what you want, but the move has been to be makil on ads, and even especially in a case where like Zoom, where the ads aren't directly affecting your experience. They're not popping up in that sort of way. So I think, you know, I don't think anyone's invoked this, so it's an interesting new angle to consider. I'd say, given the trend on you know, physical advertisements in newspapers, the trend would be to be makil, but it doesn't mean it has to be, right? Maybe there's room to reclaim our pre-advertising innocence.
No, well, I don't want to go in that direction anyway. So the newspapers is a great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Shani. Judah, you had a question?
Yeah, so I actually asked both questions in the chat. They were the last two. One was, how does Zoom compare to the gramophone for doctors or ill people on Shabbos that was created in Israel? Is there any differentiation with that? And how does using Zoom compare to using a microphone on Shabbos? Is it the coal problem or the electricity problem?
So I think the person who addresses this directly is Rav Shechter. Rav Shechter says that phones, a normal telephone, is not clear what the prohibition is. Obviously, it's not in the spirit of Shabbos, but a technical prohibition, not clear what it would be. So apparently, you know, assuming he's really relying on that, he's quoting Rav Moshe on that. Sounds like he mostly agrees. So the issue of you know, gramophones are sort of an extra level of distancing. So you might not have that extra level, but that's sort of a secondary factor. And what was the other thing? Gramophones, and what was the other?
Was one right before, so that is
microphones.
Yeah, microphones on Shabbos. What's, you know,
so a microphone is similar to a telephone. A microphone is I mean, there's some dispute about the exact details, but essentially your sound, you put your sound into the microphone, and then it either puts out a new sound or it somehow shifts the sound, just like in a telephone. I think that at least Rav Shechter sees them as the same. I think you see that in what he sent out about reading the Megillah. He indicates that he sees telephones and microphones essentially as the same. That's why he allows the telephone for the Megillah. So that's a kula. Here I guess it's also a kula, but they're equivalent. They'd be equivalent in terms of that. Zoom has the problem of the visual element. That's where he's machmir on Zoom, because there's roshem. You're writing on the other screen. But I think in terms of the sound, he treats them as the same everywhere I've seen.
Is that why people refuse to be videoed? Like, I mean, there's a news event, they walk away when a reporter comes over to them with the camera?
Yeah. So that's, I think, you know, I said before, I think this is based on the Rav, that if you pose for a picture, that also counts as roshem, because your movements are affecting the picture that's going to be developed, or the video that's going to be developed, or even if it's not developed, just a temporary video. So that view holds that there's a prohibition, at least there are banan, of doing that. And yeah, and it would be the same thing, the same issue here.
Okay, Ned, I think you had a question.
Yeah, in regards to Rav Shechter's like differentiation, the difference between Rav Shechter's Hebrew psak and the psak that was translated, in terms of, I guess, the directing those who are knowledgeable in the Halakhic system, those who are capable of reading the Hebrew psak, that they should that they have that sort of he basically allows for the use of the telephone in the case of Sakhan Fashot. My question is, sort of, many find themselves in a situation which I suppose one of the parties is more halachically knowledgeable than the than like, let's say, those who you're trying to communicate with. So sort of how should that, I guess the concern is sort of if you have, you might end up causing more problems on the side that is less halachically knowledgeable. So just wondering exactly how to approach that issue.
Yeah, it's a good question, and this ties into the question I was saying before of retail versus wholesale. Meaning certain psakim, and the Gemara talks about this idea of halacha vein morin kain. Sometimes the halacha is a certain way, but you're not supposed to tell people because, well, there's a few different understandings, but one understanding at least is it'll lead to misuse and abuse. It'll lead to slippery slopes, and it's better to keep it on the down low, keep it among people who know. So I assume this is a reflection of that idea. When interacting with people who have, who don't necessarily have the knowledge, and I guess, maybe you're asking the wrong person because, I gave the shiur and I translated the Hebrew and I translated it on my Facebook post too. So maybe I shouldn't have done that if you really want to hide the details more. But I think the idea would be to be responsible. It's a question of if you know for a fact that if you tell the person the basis of the permission, they will abuse it, it's probably better not to do that. Alternative way of looking at it is to trust the people you're talking to take them seriously as halakhic subjects. And if you say that it's usher for this reason, and this is applicable here but not elsewhere, and be responsible with that information, that's another approach. I guess it's slightly less safe in some ways, but maybe it's also empowering. Maybe there are other benefits if you actually explain to people the reasons for the basis for the heter. But I think it really depends on the case, depends on the situation, depends on the halakhic category. Yeah.
Maishu Tuckman, you had a question?
Yes, I just wanted to say with regard to the question that he posed about the microphone, that plays very much into the hearing aids that people don't think a half second about, calling up someone to the Torah with a hearing aid on Shabbos, and no one has no problem with it, but it's not so clear that there's a real problem with that either, but it's just something to put in your...
That's a really important point. I think this touches on a larger point about electricity, and I didn't have time to get into this in detail, but I guess I do now for those who want to stay, which is that electricity, I mentioned that psak generally has settled on Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's position, that it's prohibited midrabanan or as a strong minhag. The upside of that position is it gives you a lot of flexibility. When you need to be makil, when you need to be lenient for doctors or for people with hearing aids, it's very flexible, because once something's derabanan and it's indirect and it's for a mitzvah, that's pretty easy to get those, and then it's mutter. So and that's essentially is how hearing aids work. I mean, I had a whole discussion. I have a friend of mine who has a cochlear implant, and we were talking about it, and I said, my understanding is if you ask poskim, they would say that talking to you would be fine, but talking, directing your speech at the sound receptacle of the implant would be technically prohibited. So it's interesting. It's not exactly clear where the halacha goes, but there's a clear interest in permitting those cases. You don't want people with hearing aids to not be able to hear on Shabbos. And at the same time, if you applied that consistently, if you take Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach to its logical conclusion, you end up with not just Zoom Seders, but a lot of things. You have a normal Shabbos lunch, not during coronavirus season. So, Zoom, okay, it's electricity, and it's for a mitzvah of the Suda, and maybe you do it with a shinui. So, okay, or you ask a non-Jew to turn on your Zoom, and now it's mutter, according to many people. That, no posting is going to say that. And so the problem is you want to be able to have the prohibition against electricity be flexible enough that the things that need to be usher are usher, and the things that need to be mutter are mutter. And it's a really delicate dance. And I think you're seeing some of the implications here and some of the tensions and some of the fissures here in this very complex issue.
Joshua, you had another question?
Yeah, sorry. I just had a clarification question in terms of your point about realist versus formalist and how kind of the borders on that dividing line kind of switched around. So, like, for example, with someone for example, Rav Schachter permitted someone to use Megillah and said that it would be diavad, putter you. What was your Could you help clarify that a little bit? I didn't really understand where
Yeah, I
you
guess
were.
the question there is, if I talk to you using an electronic device, am I actually talking to you or something else? Am I just, producing electrons? That's essentially the question. If I'm just producing electrons, that's a very limited question. It depends on your view of electricity, maybe a couple of other specific things, and that's that. If I say that talking to you over the phone, or maybe let's say better over Zoom, is actually a real experience. And just like writing with a pen is writing over chat or over texting, or maybe even over having your image be projected is really writing. If it's really writing, then that should be Asur D'Oraisa, and that's I think where Katz is coming from. At the same time, that's a chumrah in terms of Shabbos, but in terms of Megillah, that's a kula if you say that. And of course, you can distinguish in these cases, but I don't think people always do. That hearing the Megillah by phone or hearing it over Zoom are you actually hearing the Megillah or not? If you're actually hearing the Megillah, that's a kula, right? You fulfilled the mitzvah. If you say it's just a bunch of electronic noise being sent your way that happens to sound like a Megillah reading, but is actually meaningless, you're not Yotzei. So that's I think a large question here that's underlying a lot of these issues. And I think it's interesting that America and Israel seem to be on different pages on that issue, but it's a chumrah and the kula. It's just a different way of experiencing how electronic communication works.